Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Exploring Experimental Policy Design Method session with Policy Lab UK. I'm Sanjan Sabherwal, I'm the Head of Policy Innovation, and I'm joined by a number of my quite talented and brilliant colleagues. And actually, sometimes you forget just how interesting your colleagues can be. And when you're having conversations in a project or over lunch, you sometimes forget that actually that is worth sharing with a wider group. So if you are having lunch right now, welcome to our extended Policy Lab dining table. The format of this session will be that our panelists will introduce you to an experimental method each before moving to panel discussions where we'll be answering hopefully a lot of your questions. So with no further ado, let me introduce our panel. So we've got firstly Stephen Bennett.
Hello, I'm a visual artist, I'm a policy professional, and I'm co-head of Policy Lab.
Thank you, and over to Vanessa.
Hi, I'm Vanessa. I'm an ethnography lead in Policy Lab, passionate about all things applied anthropology and creative approaches to research.
Wonderful. And Pratik?
Hi folks, I'm Pratik Butch. I'm Head of Collective Intelligence at Policy Lab, and I like data.
Lovely. And Kate?
Hi, I'm Kate Langham. I'm co-design lead at Policy Lab, and I'm passionate about collaborative processes for policy innovation.
Wonderful. So just in case you've never heard of us before, Policy Lab's mission is to radically improve how policy is made. And we do that through design, innovation and people-centered approaches. And since 2014, when we were set up, we've done over 200 demonstrator projects across policy, whether that's in the national security space, in the social space, or even in the environment. People, and have hired a number of government firsts, including the first film ethnographer of government, the first policy designer, and actually that's me, and the first creative technologist more recently. So, we often find that these disciplines both deepen our expertise, but also cross-fertilize. So I'm quite excited that we've got a real diverse panel today. And then the policy profession standards have recently included policy design as part of the kind of best practice in government, user-centered design being a part of that. And there's a really lively policy design community with over 100 people in it already that are spread across most departments. So we're challenging ourselves now to think a bit more radically about what next practice is for policy innovation. And last year we identified 12 experimental methods that we were really interested in testing further. Some of those we'll be talking about today, like serious games, which we now call playable systems, art in policy, and even engaging through the metaverse. So we're also really interested in bringing a more than human perspective into government. So a recent project, we explored how an AI agency could give voice to the natural world. So both AI being a more than human thing and the natural world being a more than human thing. So whatever you're thinking about doing over the next hour, whether that's poised to take notes or munching on a sandwich, I really hope you enjoy listening to our panelists, and I'd encourage you to think about what your first impressions of these new ideas might be. You'll have plenty of time to consider your questions, and I'd like to first introduce Stephen Bennett.
Right. Can I ask, is the presentation showing? Do we know? We think it is. Cool. Sorry, I've just got to press a button on my Teams and show you this. So I mentioned before that I am a visual artist. Before getting stuck right into the presentation, I just wanted to show some of my artwork here. So this is a show called Glasshouse from 2021, and it explored the intersection of art, climate science, and climate policy. So this is what
We might have lost Stephen. Why don't we adapt and go to our second speaker first, and then hopefully if we re-find Stephen, we can bring him in. How does that sound? So Vanessa, are you okay to go next, and we'll bring back Stephen when he's arrived?
Yeah, absolutely. So hi, everybody. As I said, my name is Vanessa and I lead ethnography in the team. And I guess just to set up what ethnography is, so it's a type of qualitative research that's borrowed from anthropology. And nowadays, lots of businesses and private sector organisations deploy anthropological methods to kind of improve services and products. And we're doing the same. So we started doing ethnography when Policy Lab started. And I think what I wanted to set up was that really for us, there are two main kind of facets of doing ethnography. So the first is that it's about participating in people's everyday lives. And the second is the importance of observation. So watching and learning through observing what's going on in people's worlds. And the way that we typically go and do that is by spending time with our participants in any sample. So we go and we meet people in their homes and their workplaces, and we spend time listening and learning about their lives. And we use that to inform policy design. In lab, we have a really strong visual sort of ethos to our research. And this started when Policy Lab hired government's first ever film ethnographer, Kaina Gawley, in 2015. And since then, we've made some incredible films that really bring to life some of the policy issues that we work on. Here you can see one of the film ethnographers that we work with outside of prison. And what we do is we really use the camera as a way to both kind of capture insights, but then also to create films that are really engaging and disrupt kind of how policy is made. Now, we've been doing film ethnography, as I said, since 2015, and although it still feels very new in government and something that continually we're adapting, we have since been kind of experimenting with film ethnography and how we can push it forward. So when the pandemic hit, I was going to give you the date, but it's all a bit of a blur. But when the pandemic hit, we started to adapt our film ethnography processes, and we created a bespoke methodology that involved working with people around England, and we got them to film their own lives and send us films via WhatsApp. And then we curated the films that they sent into ethnographic kind of thematic subjects. And this is a picture from one of those films. And I think for the benefits of that approach was that it felt really participatory. So people had a lot of control over kind of what they wanted to show us. And also we carried out the research over sort of 12 weeks. So we were spending more time with people over a longer period. And that was really interested and pushed us to thinking more about participatory ethnography, which we're really passionate about in Policy Lab. So there's a lot of thinking around kind of how to make research more equitable, and how to think about the relationship between researchers and subjects or participants. And we wanted to bring some of the forefront of that thinking into our film ethnography processes. So on my last project, I worked with a group of people with lived experience, and they helped to co-produce the films that we made on our project. And we're really interested in continuing to push that approach further. From participatory approaches like using WhatsApp and giving people power, we started to think about the online world and really pushing into new frontiers of where we could do ethnography. And one of the things that we really want to try out, and I'm kind of exposing you to our latest thinking here, and it's really an open invitation if anyone would like to explore this with us, is what would it be like to do ethnography where people spend so much of their time online? And this is a still from a video game, and we've been kind of consulting with some of our network outside of government who are starting to make films and carry out research in online worlds and games. So what would it look like to carry out film ethnography where we're sitting with people and they're designing their avatars and we're spending time with them in different worlds? What would that tell us about the real world, as it were? It's an open question, and we're really excited in exploring where that goes. And then finally, I guess I just wanted to kind of create an opposition to that, which is that as we think about so much happening online in the virtual world, it also feels like post-pandemic, there's been a real move to think about embodied research. And we've kind of exposed ourselves to some of the latest thinkings around taking a really embodied approach to ethnography. On the recent project I worked with Kate, actually, we captured different senses when thinking about inclusion and inclusive design in the job centres. And we really want to continue pushing our approach to sensory ethnography further. So we're comfortable making films, but what would it look like to turn up our kind of capturing of different sounds? Whoop. and that's my alarm. I've got to stop. You can see that I could keep going forever on this because I'm absolutely passionate about exploring where ethnography could go. But in the interest of time, I'm going to stop there, and I think I'm going to hand over to Pratik.
Stephen hasn't been able to rejoin, unfortunately, just yet. I think we'll go with that. Hi, everyone. And as they say now, for something a little bit different, I'm going to talk to you about collective intelligence, which, if you haven't come across the term before, can seem a little science fiction. You know, it might especially do when I start talking about melding the brains of human beings with the capabilities of computers. But take a pause and think about the really simple premise that collective intelligence is based upon, at least the way we conceptualize it. We're talking about the fact that groups of people, and whether that's the hundreds of folks on the line today, or your colleagues in your department, or people living in communities, groups of people are more knowledgeable about any given topic than any one of us could be as an individual. And over the last couple of years, me and some colleagues at Policy Lab have set up a team within Policy Lab to try and tap into that collective knowledge that might exist across diverse groups of people. And in the just shy of 2 years now that we've been experimenting with this approach, we've worked with people across the public sector, and not just with people who work in the public sector, but with their stakeholders, domain experts, and the members of the public that our policies and services serve, to try and harness the collective knowledge that they hold about a range of different topics, and to serve them up. Crucially, after all, this is about radically improving policy making, as Sanjan introduced, serve the collective knowledge that sits across people's expertise into actionable insights that policymakers then take forward into things that make a difference in the real world. So very briefly going to talk you through about how we set about doing that. In the couple of years that we've been working on collective intelligence, we've used an open source piece of software called Polis, pol.is. You may well have come across it. It's been used most prominently in Taiwan, where the government there is using it as a piece of software to engage with citizens on matters of primary and secondary legislation. Here in the UK, we've used this open source piece of software, put it onto kind of gov.uk digital infrastructure, and we've invited civil servants, domain experts, members of the public often, to come together and give us their thoughts, their new ideas, and their reactions to existing policy, and helping to develop new ideas for future policy kind of directions. And what the software does is it allows people to vote on particular topics, and I'll show you how shortly. It crucially, in a different way to kind of how surveys work, allows participants to embed their own, to input their own statements. And what the machine learning algorithm in the background of the software does is separate people out according to how they vote into different opinion groups, examples of which you kind of see on the screen. So if you've taken part in one of these exercises to date, you would come across a very simple set of statements, short, sharp ideas that you give your gut reaction to. You either vote to agree or disagree, or if you're unsure, you can pass. And what the software does is kind of two things. It separates people out anonymously into different opinion tribes according to the way that they vote on the various statements. And really importantly, it sets out where areas of consensus lie between all the participants. And that's often incredibly useful for policymakers, because it's really great to bring people together. I'll share one example of later on, who may have opposing views, and you can actually get a hold of where they agree as much as where they disagree. So in the dozen or so projects that we have run, we've done something really quite simple. We've started these online discussions with a set of between 30 and 70 initial seed statements. And at that point, we hand over the discussion to the participants. They may be recruited from government departments or agencies. They may be domain experts. They might be members of the public, or a mix thereof. Once they're in the debate, they get to vote on the existing statements. They get to put their own ones in. Worth noting that we do a little bit of light touch moderation just to keep things civil and appropriate for a public platform. But releasing moderated statements back into the system for others to vote on allows the conversation to evolve. Something for policymakers to really kind of get their head around a little bit in a way is that we're handing that power to decide, or to discuss, over to the participants and watching what then emerges. And then we do a couple of pieces of analysis. We take the themes that come out and turn them into kind of policy recommendations in some cases. We also have moved into some creative ways of presenting the opinions that emerge. And then I don't think I mentioned it because I'm rushing through this. We also asked participants to give us their demographic information when they participate, kind of where do they live, what's their age bracket, how long have they served in the public service. So we can start to say these different opinion groups that have emerged, do they segregate with seniority or geography or professional discipline? I'm going to end with a couple of points as to how we've applied this kind of approach, and a bit of a question to you folks too, who are on the call. We've been using this in a range of different areas, from whether it's national security to defence to the design of fisheries management policy. I think you're going to hear a little bit more about that shortly, and how can we modernise and reform the civil service. The topics are varied, but I guess the things that we've learned throughout the different debates that we run is that we are providing an online space for people who might not otherwise participate in policy making to contribute their views. If we start a conversation of this nature by pointing people towards an existing strategy or policy, you can stress test people's response to that current thinking. Particularly in policy, in projects where we've brought together knowingly people who we know have very different or opposing views, such as we did with fisheries management. This tool really helps draw out consensus and helps you focus on where divergent views might contain new ideas. And in debates around the future of the water system and how that might be regulated, for example, we started to see new ideas emerging. I've been told I need to move on, rightly so, because I'm out of time. This is again another open invitation for people who are interested to get in touch with us. I think, are we going to move down to Stephen again? No, I think we're going to move on.
I think
Yeah,
I'm
move on
going
to
next.
Kate, I think.
Right.
Yes. Okay, I think I should have control here, should I? Yes. Okay. Hi, I'm Kate. I'm going to talk to you today about playable systems. As it used to be called serious gaming, but we're now referring to it as playable systems. So I'm sure you recognise this game. Games are as old as human beings. There's always been some sort of formal ritual play or structured play. And this is Elizabeth Magee, who designed the Landlord's game in 1903. She wanted to teach people about the dangers of monopolies. She could have written a book, but she designed a game, a playable model of property markets. And it had, at that point, two different sets of rules. One, the competitive rule set, which we're probably very familiar with today, and that was about the reality of the property market. And then there was a cooperative rule set that was sort of trying to favour a fairer society and a fairer system. And I guess with this, it's all about understanding what playable systems can do, especially in a policy context. And that is, it enables people to solve problems, negotiate, overcome challenges, and work with opponents whilst respecting a clearly defined set of rules. And I'm just going to talk to you now about a project that we worked on in 2022. Policy Lab worked very closely with DEFRA, and the Welsh Government and CFAS scientists to design a policy game for using in the design of the future sea bass fisheries management plan. We identified, and again, this was using other methods that we had in terms of gathering our evidence, one of which was POLIS, as Pratik's just been talking about. So we used collective intelligence and lived experience insights to understand what the current challenges were within that sea bass FMP, and then the potential solutions. And those solutions were derived from stakeholders' insights themselves. So really understanding what people's main challenges were, there were 13 of them, and potential solutions that could be fixed to those challenges. We then held co-design workshops. We invited all of our stakeholders to join us and encouraged them to sit around a table and engage in in-depth discussions around the future of the FMP, playing a game, a card game. So the challenges and solutions were created. We had a challenge card in the middle of the table, which you can see here, and each participant was given a number of cards. 2 to 4 solution cards to review and prioritise. And the participants were then asked, as you can see here, to rank their priorities as to their highest and lowest, and then engage in a discussion, sharing each other's views and listening to other people's opinions to understand the bigger picture of the policy landscape. It was extremely complex, and rather than people thinking about their own perspective, working in silos, we were trying to get them to think about being collaborative, playing this game, engaging, listening to others to understand their perspective. Once the participants had ranked their priorities, they were then asked to vote on their preferred solutions, and each of the solution was linked to a little icon like a shrimp or a prawn or a seaweed, for example, as you can see in the picture. And then they put their tokens down as their preferred preference for that challenge. And then we asked them to chat again about which one they'd selected and why. And what was so interesting here was that at this point, people were listening to scientists' opinions, ENGOs, the MMOs, the people monitoring the ports, the police on the water, for example, and then all the fishers, the commercial and recreational. And by listening to everyone else's opinions, what we often found is that when people were placing their tokens, they sometimes changed their opinion because they'd understood the bigger picture by playing this game. And all of their opinions and preferences were then ranked and collated, and that was all taken forward into the final stage to help us co-design with those stakeholders the future BAS FMP. And you can see a couple of quotes here. We did have some very positive feedback from it. Not everybody wanted to engage, but everybody stayed and played the game. It took 2.5 hours each. So nobody left the room when we were joining in these sessions, and we did online and in-person sessions. And what we found in terms of our reflection was that this playable system process really enabled all players to interact and engage in very complex policy issues. They thought critically about them. They tested future scenarios in a theoretical, safe context. And this the uniqueness of playing a game, provided it was accessible for all, everybody could do it. It provided a level playing field for everyone to engage, although the interactions were mediated by rules in terms of allowing us to move on at a certain point and respect other people's opinions. So it was a framework for discussion. And a final reflection is that playable systems really enable stakeholders to see the world from a different perspective, understand the bigger picture of policy landscape, and co-design the policy together. So I'm going to hand over now, I think, to Stephen.
Yeah, and first of all, just apologies for the Wi-Fi meltdown. But hopefully now, having heard the other 3 speakers, you've kind of got the picture here, which is taking a non-typical method, whether that be film ethnography, co-design, collective intelligence, and bringing that into policy. So my background, as I said right at the beginning, is an artist. So what I've done is, and this is one of my pieces here that you can see on the screen at the moment. So this is the discipline that I've really focused on over the last year or so, is experimenting, exploring the role that art might play in policy. And I've done that in Policy Lab via a program called Manifest. So we actually ran this with support from the Policy Profession Unit, who are helping to run this festival, and the Arts and Humanities Research Council actually funded the artists. And in short, it says it on the slide, this initiative was to investigate and evaluate, which is common to all of our methodologies, artistic approaches that might be relevant for policy. Now, the way I'm going to do that in this short presentation is by focusing on the work of these 3 artists on the right, and those are 3 artists that we brought into 3 different government teams. So starting off with Dryden. Dryden joined the Changing Futures team, which is in DLUC. This was a team focusing on multiple disadvantage, and this is where people have one or more experiences of things like the criminal justice system, domestic violence, substance misuse, homelessness, and so on. Dryden's approach was both simple yet also really powerful. He drew people. That's his practice. And he drew people involved in the multiple disadvantage policy challenge. This included some of the policy officials you can see in the room there, stakeholders and frontline staff involved in multiple disadvantage. It also included people who had lived experience of multiple disadvantage. You can see from the quote at the bottom of the screen there from Jean Comrie in the Changing Futures team. She really talks about her emotional response to the work. But she also talks about the way Dryden's work exposed and brought out multi-layered policy interactions, which unfortunately feed into the day-to-day experience of people facing multiple disadvantage. So that brought out some real insight in that policy area. The second artist is Semiconductor. They worked with the Government Office for Science and the Futures and Foresight team, who are on the left-hand side of this slide. Semiconductor created maps of how people have historically thought about the future. So, for example, in pre-industrial revolutionary times, especially in the UK, other countries as well, societies did not necessarily conceive of the progress of time in our sort of modern day parlance. They also looked at more modern day knowledge and science relating to the neurocognitive processes in our brains, which actually enable future thinking to take place, or thinking about the future to take place. So they posed these really interesting questions about the human condition and how it relates to the future. And some of you on the call may sort of empathise with how that thinking about the future might relate to policy development. As you can see from the quote from Tom, I think he found it both vulnerable but also inspiring to see his work portrayed as art on a gallery wall. The third artist, Christopher Samuel, took this idea to the next level. He worked with the Community Ownership Fund team in DLUC, and he literally put a green paper on the wall. The policy team were completely bowled over by this, to see their policy on a gallery wall. But even more amazing to them was that Chris wrote this green paper by himself. No track changes, no comments from other people. He did it himself. And he brought into the green paper perspectives from his own background and his own identity. And that includes being a disabled man of colour growing up in an urban environment. This helped the policy team in a number of ways. It really helped them, most obviously, think about diversity and equality in the Community Ownership Fund, who's able to apply for it and have access to it. It also helped them think about bringing in lived experience to their work and how they might factor that in alongside economic analysis and other sort of bits of evidence. And it also raised some really lovely questions about modes of engagement, the role that a long written document might play in engaging a policy area to the public. So in conclusion, we took some really interesting themes from Manifest. Some of these will be common to some of the other areas you've heard about in this presentation, but some of them more unique to art. So, for example, art can help policymaking by thinking outside of the box in the development and design of policies. It can draw attention to the aspects of policymaking that usually go unnoticed. It makes space for and prompts reflection in policymaking. I think that was obvious from the quote from Tom in Go Science. It helps communicate and engage on policy questions. I think that's probably one of the most obvious areas. Also brings out the human elements in the policy system, as we saw from Dryden's work. And finally, and not to be underestimated, the sort of effects on the well-being of civil servants and people involved in policymaking, including providing an outlet from stress and a source of sort of inspiration and enjoyment. The great news is that we're now running a second year of this pilot with 3 different artists who will go in 3 new policy areas. So now, and once again, apologies for causing confusion, I think I'm going to hand back to Sanjan.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Stephen. That was lovely and great to hear from all of our panelists. And actually, during that process, we've been absolutely inundated with questions. So thank you all for your amazing questions that have been popping up. And actually, I think Jack's question, which is a very simple one for me to answer, actually, which was how do we actually get in touch with Policy Lab and how do we start working with you potentially, is the best way to do that is actually to email us or go to our website and you'll be able to find our contact details. I believe our contact details are team@policylab.gov.uk, so hopefully not too hard to remember, but you can find out all the details about us online. And actually, Kalyani had a really interesting question, which we might use to kick off a conversation, which is how can innovative and experimental policy design methods be embedded or institutionalized in organizations such as government and other arm's length bodies? I think that also linked to a question earlier on, which was about, how might our work be put into sort of business as usual as well, rather than being purely a kind of expertise that we hold in the team. So I don't know if anyone in the panel wanted to come in on that question. How do we embed these methods?
Shall I go first?
Absolutely.
I think, and it'd be great if other in the panel sort of want to contribute this. I think the most obvious way that I think we've all talked about is sort of showing the thing. We've demonstrated this through projects. And that's only one part of this. But I think it's a really important part. We have, through the project process, we've shown that these methods can play a role in the different policy areas. So it's very simple, but I think in some respects, actually just demonstrating and us running the project, showing how this method can apply in a policy scenario is one of our ways of trying to institutionalize it. But I think there's other parts of the puzzle as well, and I'd be interested in others have views on that.
Yeah, Vanessa.
I guess just to build on that, I suppose through demonstrating projects, we unearth some of the barriers and constraints and systemic kind of conditions in which innovation is possible. And really from that, I suppose we can start to understand what broader kind of aspects of our organizational culture needs to shift to enable these kinds of methods. And that's really useful then for continuing this journey of embedding experimental approaches in business as usual.
I'm happy to come in, actually. Yeah, just I echo what Stephen and Vanessa have both said, and I think it is that sort of getting people to realise that this is an okay thing to do, to experiment and to explore. And actually, by looking at our case studies of all the projects we've worked on and the feedback that we get from our commissioning teams, from our stakeholders, I think that in itself sort of speaks volumes for why this needs to be embedded as a sort of standard in policy practice when appropriate. And there's so many methods you can use that it's about applying the right method to the right project. And there's some that can be more extreme, but there's some other simple, safe ways of exploring experimental policy making. So it doesn't have to be a massive change. It can be a gradual shift, but I think it will come in time, and it's already doing that. So give it a go. That's what I say.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. And just to sort of wrap this question up, I think it's a lot of it's about building that ability to generate your own resilience and take a little risk yourself. And we've probably all in our own methods and all practices sort of found ourselves sometimes in a comfort zone and other times in a place where we are unfamiliar, in unfamiliar territory. We have to kind of maintain confidence and sort of portray that to others so that they also believe that the method is worth trying. There was a couple of really interesting questions about engaging different groups. That sort of one of the themes I think that runs throughout the methods we have is sort of that diversity of population that we're wanting to engage with, whether it's collective intelligence or through even art and making things accessible, and of course ethnography. So one of the questions is about how do we actually choose who to engage with? How do we make sure that that's done ethically? And then what does that how does that link to being something that can be advice that's valid and valuable inside of a policy system? So yeah, anyone want to talk about engaging the right audiences and then making robust the evidence? Vanessa.
It's a big question, and I feel like there's multiple questions within that question. But the first thing that comes to mind for me is that I think what is valuable is about having a range of different methods to respond to the question that you're looking at. And through being led by the purpose of your work, I think that guides who we interact with. And I think I've really found a difference between some of our like co-design methods that maybe speak to professionals and bring in people with a bit more formalized lived experience versus our ethnographic work, which is speaking to people who often have never been involved in policy design, or even they're just living their lives and they don't normally engage with like participatory processes. And I think it's important to include and listen to like a mixture of different people depending on what insights you're trying to gather. And in order to reach people who, I hate the term hard to reach, because I think it shows like it's very top down. It's assuming that, it's on people to be found, whereas really like it's up to us as policymakers to make an effort to listen to people. And so I guess in Policy Lab, we have a range of techniques for actually going and meeting people where they're at. So that's quite an overarching answer, and probably one we could spend a good hour chatting over if we had the time, but I'll hand over to others if anyone else wants to come in.
Stephen, do you want to come in on this?
I think the participant recruitment element is so important, and we have built up a lot of skills and knowledge in this area. And actually, I think the sad fact is you actually need to really invest in it, and actually spend money on doing that to do the job really well. The sea bass fisheries management plan project I thought was really interesting, where there were at least two different communities at play there, and they required quite different engagement methods. So there was a group of fishers who actually are going out to sea, the sort of traditional coastal communities. And I think to reach those groups, we actually had to go out and print off posters and put them in sort of the places where those people might go. So cafes, pubs, sort of harbours, very, very, literally printing off pieces of paper. And then there was another community who were much more likely to do lone fishing, so not sort of amateur, not for profit. And sort of therefore won't necessarily in those coastal communities who actually maybe offering acting a bit more like lone wolves. And there, I think we used a collective intelligence approach because they were much more likely to engage online and digitally. So we actually had two incredibly different. So Pratik's talked about the amazing collective intelligence work. It's a very digital, quite technological informed approach. We had to do them both to actually reach the communities that we needed to in that project. And we only found that, as Vanessa said, by doing some research first before thinking about how to engage the participants.
Yeah, and I just wanted to pick up on that because actually one of the interesting things that the collective intelligence often does is sort of compare and contrast experts with non-experts and puts them in the same space. So Pratik, do you want to reflect on that?
Yeah, in either case, as of up until now, we've been operating on a kind of invite-only basis. So there'll be experts known to government officials. There'll be members of the public recruited. Stephen, you mentioned the skills and knowledge that we've kind of captured over the years of recruiting participants. On occasion, you will need to go to outside agencies whose job it is to recruit people in for research, especially important for the digital side of it. When you're trying to get to hundreds of people, we have used recruitment agencies who have given us a panel of 100 or more people who are their demographics are broadly representative of the UK. And again, those are sort of attempts to try and iron out the kind of way of biasing yourself by going to people who you directly know, but on an invite-only basis so far on Polis, certainly, for reasons of cybersecurity and all sorts of other things, we've been going to people who are largely already known to us. Apart from that, when we go to the public, our ambition is to open it up more broadly in terms of participation, and we're hoping to scale to that quite soon. The other thing is recruiting participants is hard and it takes more time than you'd expect.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know, Kate, if you had any final reflections on the recruitment side of things.
Yeah, I mean, I just think coming back to the BAS project, really, I think what's so powerful is as Stephen said, we were using different methodologies, and I think this is really important with any project, that you're using different methodologies according to your stakeholder audience you're trying to engage. So we had the lived experience that we'd gathered and the insights from that aspect of actually going and spending time with a lot of commercial fishers out at the ports. And also recreational, but they were very hard to gauge because they just hide away fishing, as Stephen said. So that Polis coming in at the point that we had a rich evidence base from the lived experience research that we could then put into that Polis system was so powerful, because then we were able to open up the discussion to this whole new range of stakeholders, the recreational fishers who were harder to find hiding away fishing, and actually put in some of the factual information we'd gathered from our lived experience to sort of sense check that. And all of that designed the game, because there was an interesting question, I think, that David asked about how do you design a playable system rule set without already knowing everything about the system. And what the lived experience and Polis did was gave us the insights to have those threads of how we could create a playable systems game, working with scientists, because with any playable system, it's really great if you can find the thread of consensus, and that was that it had to be led by science, because everybody wanted a healthy sea bass stock. So we had that thread that everybody agreed on. That it's like, okay, let's build on that, taking in all those views and opinions, working with CFAS scientists. So we had that really strong foundation base to then take that into this co-design playable systems and get stakeholders of all different from all the different landscapes around the table, which had never been done before. We were told at the beginning of that project, whatever you do, don't put them all in the same room. There'll be an argument. Well, of course, that's what we had to do, because that's how we were going to move the policy forward. But the gaming system, built on those other forms of methodologies, experimental methodologies, allowed us to do that in a way that was evidence-based and led by science.
Yes, thank you, Kate. That's really, really interesting. One of the other, I think, threads that sort of cuts across all is the need for us to not only sort of believe that we within the team have the expertise we need to do these methods, but actually there was a question around how do we engage with the outside world, with academia, with other experts to deepen our understanding of these methods. And I wondered whether the panel could reflect on that. I know we've touched on some of this in the presentations as well, but also whether what the impact of actually trialing it in a policy context means for the method, maybe from the theory to the practice being a very different thing. So any reflections on engaging externally with Pratik?
So I think, speaking about policy and actually the other methods that we're using to capture, kind of starting to use to capture collective intelligence, they're being developed by people outside of our team and outside of government, outside the UK. So kind of by obligation, we have to collaborate with the people who wrote the code for the software tool, for example. And we've got a really healthy relationship with the people who created Polis. There are also experts in Nesta, for example, who work on it. There are people, again, in Taiwan where it's been used prominently, and in academia. And our sort of attempts to date has been conversational. We've been trying to get advice from folks who have used this type of technique, and then ultimately the aim here is for us to talk about our experience of having used the tool. To answer the second part of your question, every time we do a project, we have a slightly different hypothesis we can test. Can we dial down the moderation right down to almost nothing? For instance, can we present the data in an interesting way by being really artistic and creative, or can we automate the reporting on some of it? So we try and test with each new project a different sort of hypothesis, and everything we learn, the next time we run a conversation, we kind of adapt our approach. And when we work out loud like that, we might do a blog post on it, we might do a conference session. Others working on the similar kind of stuff come and help build our process up a little bit better. We're thinking about also how to kind of formalize some of that. And of course, our other sister team, not the policy profession, but the open innovation team, are experts in working with kind of academia, and we've also lent on them a little bit to try and get kind of university experts into. There's just so much out there.
Yeah, thanks. Anyone else want to draw on their relationship with externals? Yeah, Vanessa.
I think what I really like about the way that we design projects is that very simply at the start of every project, we engage academics and sector experts about the research question or challenge question that we're exploring. And then we have the space, very luckily, to design a methodology that really feeds off their advice. For example, the Job Centre project that I mentioned earlier, we designed a phase of the work that was all about understanding what inclusive design in the built environment means. And so we got to speak to some of the world's leading practitioners in inclusive design and then use that in our project. And I think the other example I wanted to share was on another project that Stephen mentioned, working for DLUC about multiple disadvantage. My colleague and I took a new systems change framework that had been designed by some incredible practitioners outside of government. And for the first time, we applied that in a policy context. And we designed, because I think it's really interesting when you have these kind of conceptual frameworks and then you make them practical. And we designed all of these tools that we used in workshops to actually do system change, which feels quite different because sometimes systems change is something people like to think about and not actually do. And I think we helped to push that framework on. And I suppose I see our role as scanning what's outside government and bringing it in and making it practical and exploring the frontiers of how that can work in policy making. So it's absolutely what we try and do.
I just wanted to build on what Vanessa was saying actually about our work with DWP and job centres. As Vanessa was saying, we work with Jean Hewitt, who is a leading practitioner from Bureau Happold, and she was at that time just creating the new PAS Design for Mind on neurodiversity. So it was an amazing point in our project that we contacted Jean at the time that she was creating this new guideline. It was focusing on sensory engagement in the environment for people with disabilities and health conditions. And actually we were able to use her research and her findings to inform our project, and then we worked very collaboratively with Jean to ensure that everything we were doing was sort of adhering to the new guidelines, which was a really powerful way of us making sure that when we went out and put our methodology out into the field with our stakeholders that were engaging with us, that it was sort of backed by that sort of academic, if you like, or professional excellence, and that we could sense check it all the time, that we were doing things appropriately, and that actually Jean was extremely interested in the methodology we were using because she'd never seen it being done before. And off the back of that project, we're hopefully going to do another project taking this idea further and taking it a little bit more into the sort of exploratory technical side, but again around sensory mapping. And I think having an expert or experts there with you alongside on the project is a way of sense checking to make sure that we learn, and two, that we are sort of doing best practice in every stage of our project process.
Amazing. Thank you all. That was a really great set of answers. And I was wondering about moving on to a different sort of theme here, which is around some of the biases that are often sort of at play within government. And so I think one of the questions was touching upon how, maybe the civil servants aren't reflective of the wider population. How do we then how do these methods support or enable sort of a difference when it comes to challenging biases? So any reflections from you about how the methods challenge biases? And again, I think linking back to how does that link to advice that we are giving as a result of the research we do? Who's up for it?
Go on then.
Yeah, go on, Vanessa.
So I think that our ethnographic research is good at bringing in different perspectives from what's heard often in government. And I think the beauty of really in-depth methods is that they humanize different people's perspectives and experiences. And when you share film ethnography with policymakers in a room in Westminster, and it's very different to the lives that everyone in that room is leading, you can see and feel the impact of bringing in different perspectives. I guess I feel the elephant in the room here is that participatory methods are, for me, like a stand-in that we don't have proper diversity in the civil service, and therefore that we kind of create open spaces for groups and individuals to share their views in time-bound research processes. And I'm really passionate about those processes, and I think they're great at giving people platforms to share their views. But it feels to me like an interim step when we think about biases in the civil service, because ultimately, like, what would it look like for our kind of workforce and culture to be truly reflective of the population? So the interim is that we bring people in and we create all of these ways to do that, and we have a range of really exciting methods to listen to people and to counter biases. But for me, that's like one step on a journey to bigger systems change around how the civil service operates and the culture that we have here. But that's just my perspectives.
I'd echo those.
Okay. Any other perspectives from the panel?
I was just going to reflect on a project that we worked on recently for English language learning for refugees, and our aim with this project was really to get the refugees to help us co-design a new policy that would enable English language learning to be much more accessible for them. And obviously we had language barriers that we had to start thinking about. And what we did actually was we embedded the co-design work into the ethnographic phase. So when we went out to spend time with refugees in their homes and understanding their day-to-day lives and challenges and barriers and then the opportunities, we actually put a co-design activity into the day where we had developed this toolkit, which was a very simple kit that enabled the refugees without language to visually map their a standard day of them living wherever they were located, trying to access everything in their day, like dropping children off to school or getting to work, and then trying to navigate, the health system, as well as trying to get to learn their English language or get to their classes. And by using this simple toolkit, we gave them sort of maps they could build, and there were little 3D printed modes of transport that they could put down. There were blocks to say, I'm going to my work, so they put the work block out. There's a blog all about this, but what it enabled them to do is they almost created their own piece of art. It was really participatory. It was really collaborative. We didn't need language, and it was the first time a project had been done where refugees could actually show us their story and tell us their struggles, and they put little dots, the red dots, when things were really tricky and really difficult and time was against them, or a green where it was accessible. And then they had idea stars where they could start telling us ideas for improving this policy to make it more accessible, and that actually it wasn't just about the English language learning classes. There were so many other systems within the government that needed to be in place to support them, to enable them to feel safe and to have the time and headspace to learn English. So it sort of made us open this up as a sort of, actually, this is a cross-government approach we need here, not a siloed approach. And I think that was what's so interesting, and that with putting these methods in, that gives people that otherwise wouldn't maybe have had that voice in such a visual, in-depth, informative and collaborative and fun way as well. So we really built those relationships up and had some beautiful maps of their average day and ideas.
Okay. Can I jump in perhaps briefly, because I think on bias and also tying it into advice, I think one thing that these methods do is they reduce our role and policymakers' role as the kind of intermediary, right? Particularly with with true kind of ethnography, film ethnography, you're hearing from the people whose lived experience you're seeking to impact. Ethnographically inspired research that I did with landowners and managers who were making decisions about the way that their land might look in the future. We were also able to capture their voice, and photos of their land, and bring it back and put it in front of ministers. And that instantly breaks down the kind of prejudices or bias you might have about, landowners from this particular type may have these views on renewable energy, and actually they're telling you the opposite of what you previously thought in their own voice. You're intermediating less. That's one thing. And then tying it into advice is fascinating, right? Because to some extent, the format in which some of our work gets into the hands of senior decision makers is just not what they're expecting or what they're used to. We rarely produce slide decks or charts or lengthy written reports. We sometimes might, but the things we produce as outputs are often just different to what you're expecting. At the moment, we're trying to produce projects around speculative design that may or may not contain speculative prototypes of future drones, for instance. And there was the AI work around water that you mentioned earlier, Sanjan. And the physical artifacts, even the virtual things we produce, they're not what people expect. And that instantly brings a new or different focus to the messages behind that when it's put alongside the 600-page report and the chart and the presentation, which they're still going to receive. We're just adding a different stimulus.
Yeah, and just on that critique, I think there's something really interesting about the sort of form in which our work often takes, and whether that's film, which is sort of often a narrative, or the artworks that have a sort of very physical presence to them, and also a narrative, and also the kind of speculations of the future, for example. So I was interested to see, we often think about evidence in certain ways. Sometimes art might trigger an emotional response. Stephen, I wondered whether you could reflect a little bit on the emotional side of the work we do, and how that also intersects with sort of the wider context we're in. And Vanessa, you might want to come in on that as well.
Yeah, this is so interesting. I haven't necessarily got a resolved answer on this. I think, and I've been a civil servant since 2005, and I think one of the things that is really important about being a civil servant is being objective, and almost sort of dispassionate in a way, sort of having, trying to take a neutral perspective on things. And I think those are really important qualities. But I think it's also really difficult to sort of detach yourselves from emotions. and sort of pretend that there aren't emotions and sort of personal perspectives and subjectivity at play. So it's almost, I think, better to recognize that and approach that head on and think what that means. This also goes back to your bias question as well. It's much better to try and recognize that there is bias and unearth that and be everyone to be aware and present in that, rather than to pretend it doesn't exist and actually it is there. So some of the artworks I think were very emotional and brought about an emotional response. And then I think it's quite interesting to work out what to do with that and how to sort of bring that into a policy area. As I say, I don't necessarily have an answer to that. I think one thing that we know is if we don't pretend there aren't emotions, then that's when, especially the sort of relationship with the public, I think, can really break down. And I think we've sort of seen that over the last 5 or 6 years with a number of different policy areas. And I think the civil service has been a bit caught unawares at times, because we've not had that ability to have an emotional sort of dialogue with various communities.
Yeah, I would reflect on, we did some work engaging with social housing groups after the Grenfell tragedy, and that was one of the most emotional, charged sort of events we've had to run, and had to be very sensitive to the way we engage with people, but also just really have to listen and absorb and reflect that in the communications that we have and the way we engage with people. Vanessa, any reflections from you on the emotional side?
Yeah, I guess when you were speaking, Stephen, it just made me think kind of emotions are energy almost to do work. And I think sometimes, particularly on big systems change problems, there's a sense of intractability and the status quo. And the longer you've worked in government, sometimes the harder it is to feel that energy to really look at issues in new ways. And I think methods that bring emotions into policymaking can unlock some of that energy to tackle some of the most difficult policy areas. It reminds me of seeing kind of people involved in this large scale systems change project we did around multiple disadvantage, and how when people felt something, that's when they were willing to really sit down and connect with people with lived experience and sector experts and really bring new perspectives into the project. So just because it's invisible doesn't mean it's not a really useful resource to almost think about and try and generate through the work that we do, because it can be fueled into policy development and change.
Yes, absolutely. And then a couple of sort of maybe final points as we come to a close of this sort of 1 hour. There was a couple of mentions of what the right language might be when thinking about groups that the government engages with. So I think someone mentioned hard to hear groups. I think Suleiman mentioned hard to reach groups, and how that responsibility might then fall more on the group than on government, who is trying to kind of engage those groups. So I just wondered whether, if it was that language or any other parts of the language that we use in government that really resonates with you as something that we're conscious of and that we try to change in our own behaviour. I've got a couple of reflections on that if no one else does.
Sorry, me again, just briefly. In the pandemic, we pitched to the Race Disparity Unit to carry out some remote film ethnography work. And one of the findings that was conveyed so powerfully through that remote research was how some people really hated the term BAME, which was already, it was already a movement building in government that how could you possibly convey so much through that label? And obviously there's pros and cons to the term. But I think it was the hearing what that's like and hearing the very material consequences in people's everyday lives of that term, and how that generated stigma in some situations, what that word felt like, that was so interesting about that research, and actually helped the RDU to come out and say, no, we don't use BAME anymore. So I guess when we're in government, certain terms are bandied about, and we forget that in real life they have very material consequences. And I think some of our methods can help to show how the terms that we use actually affect people in everyday lives.
Yeah, thank you, Vanessa. And I'm just very conscious of time. We've got 2 minutes left. So there's a couple of things I wanted to flag. And I think probably thanks to all our panelists for such meaningful and also considered responses to these questions. And I hope you've all felt that you've had a chance to ask those questions and they've been answered. There was one question about how does this work relate to the wider global system of policy. Policy Lab was set up during an open policy making movement, which the government was a leader of. And since then, I think these methods have been embedded here. I think some of the leading spaces in the world are probably in the Scandinavian countries. There's quite a big movement in Australia and New Zealand, and also in Canada, where, especially in places where there's been sort of effectively colonialism, which is then having to readdress sort of power dynamics around indigenous communities. I think these methods are being very important in sort of creating participatory policy there. But I think in this sort of experimental methods, we are leading. When we launched this strategy, countries from around the world have contacted us, and we've been engaging with numerous countries and teaching them about these methods over the last year, and we've already done that in the past. And the final thing to say is that we are launching a Future Learn course in the next week, again in partnership with Policy Profession, where you can spend many more hours engaging with some of 3 sort of different methods that we have compiled material on, and you will also be able to engage with course case studies in those courses. So hopefully this is just the start of your learning journey with us. And again, we'd really encourage you all to reach out to us. We've really loved answering your questions, and I'm sure we'll be willing to answer many more in the time to come. So I don't know if we have much time left. So I'm going to say a huge thanks to our panel and to all of you for tuning in over your lunch, and take care.